The United States runs a deficit with Canada only because of energy, because of U.S. imports, largely of oil, and as well as electricity. So that's what runs a deficit versus Canada, where that's not being ripped off. In fact, we sell that energy, particularly the oil, at a discount to world prices to Americans. So perhaps we should ask for that subsidy back.
Perhaps we should ask for that subsidy back. That line was delivered by a man who was not yet Prime Minister, who had no official power, who was speaking from Nova Scotia to a BBC interviewer in London while Trump had just confirmed 25% tariffs on everything Canada exports to America. Most politicians in that moment would have been careful, diplomatic, measured in a way that says nothing while appearing to say something. Carney did the opposite. He called Trump a bully on camera. He promised retaliation. He dismantled the fentanyl justification with hard numbers. He inverted the ripped-off narrative completely. And he warned every ally watching that what was happening to Canada was a preview of what was coming for them. This was not a political calculation. This was a man who had spent decades at the highest levels of global finance, navigating the 2008 crisis, leading two of the world's most important central banks, telling the truth in real time about what he saw happening. And your generation deserves to watch every word of it. Subscribe to Canada Line right now because this interview predicted everything that has happened since. Let us put this moment in its full context. Trump had just confirmed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The official justification was fentanyl flowing across the border and illegal immigration from Canada into the United States. Most Canadian leaders were measuring every word, trying to leave diplomatic doors open, trying not to escalate, trying to preserve room for negotiation. And then Carney sat down with the BBC and said Canada would stand up to a bully, not would consider its options, not would explore diplomatic channels, would stand up to a bully. Your generation remembers when Canadian leaders spoke plainly about difficult situations. When diplomatic language did not mean saying nothing, when standing firm meant actually standing firm. That is what this interview was. And the fact that it happened before Carney held a single vote speaks to something important about who he actually is.
We are going to stand up to a bully. We're not going to back down. We're united, and we will retaliate.
And the effect of this on the US and on Canada economically?
Well, ultimately, the steps that the president is taking against Canada, contemplating, I guess, as well against Mexico, China, others, and threatening the world are going to rebound negatively on the United States. They're going to hit growth. They're going to move up inflation. They're going to raise interest rates. They're going to damage the U.S.'s reputation around the world. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. This is the second time in less than 10 years, less than 8 years, that the United States has, in effect, ripped up a trade agreement with its closest trading partner that it negotiated in good faith.
And there's no doubt from your perspective that that Mexico-Canada agreement, what used to be NAFTA, has been ripped up tonight.
Well, it's the U.S. is violating it. Listen, I'll speak from the perspective of Canada. The justification, purported justification for these tariffs is the cross-border movement of fentanyl and legal immigrants. And just to compare, and you will have heard this before, but it bears repeating, that in both cases, if you compare Canada relative to Mexico, the proportions are less than 1% of illegal drugs, by the way, that are all driven across the border by Americans in terms of the seizures that we've seen. Less than 1% that crosses the southern border, and it's similar numbers, less than 1% in terms of legal immigrants. There is no national security justification for this. It's the purported justification. Justice in the United States moves slowly through the courts, but this is a violation of the trade agreement.
But it's pretty clear that the US president has a bit of a fixation on Canada and on the trade deficit that is run. He thinks that America's being ripped off, although that's not the reason he's giving tonight.
Well, yes, you've just shifted the justification, as the president sometimes does. The United States runs a deficit with Canada only because of energy, because of U.S. imports, largely of oil, and as well as electricity. So that's what runs a deficit versus Canada, where that's not being ripped off. In fact, we sell that energy, particularly the oil, at a discount to world prices to Americans. So perhaps we should ask for that subsidy back.
Listen to what Carney did in that sequence. First, he named what was happening. Not a trade dispute, not a policy difference. Bullying. From the most powerful country on earth toward its closest neighbor and ally. Then he destroyed the official justification with a single statistic. Less than 1%. That is Canada's share of illegal drug flows and illegal border crossings compared to the southern border. Numbers so small they make the national security justification not just weak, but genuinely absurd. And then the inversion that should have been the headline of every news broadcast that night. The United States runs a trade deficit with Canada only because of energy, oil and electricity that Canada sells to Americans at a discount to global market prices. In other words, Canada is not taking advantage of America. Canada has been subsidizing American energy consumers. And if Trump wants to talk about who owes whom something, perhaps Canada should start that conversation differently than Washington expected. That is not a talking point. That is a former central banker who has spent his career reading balance sheets telling the most powerful politician on earth that his arithmetic is wrong. And Carney did not stop at dismantling the justification. He went further. When the interviewer pressed him on what retaliation would look like, he gave an answer that was more specific and more strategic than anything most Canadian politicians would risk saying publicly. Dollar-for-dollar matching of American tariffs. Targeted specifically at goods that would hurt the Americans making the decisions with the minimum possible damage to Canadian consumers. And when the interviewer raised the possibility of targeting the Trump circle specifically, Tesla, electricity, energy, potash, Carney said something your generation will recognize as the language of someone who has actually thought this through. It is sensible in a negotiation to target your measures where they have the greatest impact on those who are making the decisions. All options are on the table in that respect. That is not bluster. That is strategy delivered plainly to a global audience before he had won a single vote.
Well, the first thing is we have a lot of cards. We're keeping them close to our chests. We'll start playing a few. Those decisions are for the current government. I've been in close contact with our main negotiators, our foreign affairs minister, our finance minister, who've been in Washington, our public safety minister has also been down. We will take steps. I think it's reasonable to expect in the immediate term that we will match dollar for dollar the U.S. tariffs. We will target our tariffs against those goods and services that will most affect the United States and least affect Canada. But to be clear, this will have an impact on the Canadian economy, and that impact will be felt more quickly and to a greater extent than the U.S. But Canadians are in no mood to make any concessions here. This is entirely unjustified. And we have many, many other options that we don't want to deploy, but we will if we have to.
Well, could you imagine, for example, trying to target the Trump circle, perhaps tariffing Tesla's electricity, energy, potash, for example?
We have a deep strategic relationship that's been violated. As I said a moment ago, it is sensible in a negotiation to target our measures where they have the greatest impact to those who are making the decisions. So all options are on the table.
We have a lot of cards. We are keeping them close to our chest. That phrase from a man who had not yet won an election tells you everything about the mindset that has been driving Canada's response to Trump ever since. Not panic, not desperation, not the frantic search for any deal that makes the pressure stop. Strategic patience, knowing your leverage, not revealing it prematurely, being willing to absorb short-term pain rather than surrender long-term strength. Your generation understands this intuitively. You have been in negotiations. You have sat across from difficult counterparts. You know that the person who reveals all their cards first almost always loses. Carney understood the same thing before he had any official authority whatsoever, and the strategy he described in that Nova Scotia interview is the same strategy Canada has been executing for 18 months since. That consistency between what he said before becoming Prime Minister and what he has done as Prime Minister is one of the most important things Canadians should know about their current leader. But perhaps the most prescient moment in the entire interview came when Carney described what he saw happening inside the United States. He called it a fever, not a strategy, not a coherent economic philosophy, a fever raging through the American body politic, turning inward, seeking to turn back the clock, abandoning the trading relationships and alliances America itself had built and benefited from for decades. And then he said something that deserves to be heard again today. Eventually that fever will pass. That is not optimism. That is the historical perspective of someone who has watched economies and political systems go through cycles, who has seen moments of instability resolve themselves, who understands that the most disruptive phases of any system's history are usually not permanent. But then the crucial second part. In the meantime, Canada sees opportunity, with like-minded countries, with the G7-1, with Europe and Asia and the emerging economies that share Canadian values on trade and climate and rule of law. That framework, the fever will pass but Canada must build in the meantime, has been the foundation of everything Carney's government has done since taking office. And then the BBC interviewer asked about Brexit, about whether Carney had changed his view on its economic impact. And Carney said something that connects directly to what Canada is watching Washington do right now. He said, unfortunately, the United Kingdom is living with the economic impact of Brexit. He said he wished he had been wrong about it. He said the economic impacts of major trade disruptions take time to flow through, but when they do, they are harmful, and it is naive to pretend otherwise. Your generation watched Brexit happen. You watched the promises. You watched the confident predictions that Britain would thrive independently. And you watched the decade of economic disruption that followed. Carney was warning Canada and the world that what Trump was doing to American trade relationships would produce the same kind of long-term damage, that the United States would have to reestablish its credibility as a trading partner, that the rest of the world needed to look at things as they are, not as they used to be. Every word of that warning has proven accurate. This interview was recorded before Mark Carney became Prime Minister of Canada, before he won an election, before he stood beside premiers at First Ministers' meetings, before he traveled to Mexico City and Brussels and Tokyo and Charlottetown representing this country. He was speaking from Nova Scotia as a private citizen who happened to have led the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and the Bank of England through Brexit. And in 40 minutes with a BBC interviewer, he laid out the entire framework that has governed Canada's response to Trump ever since. Stand up to the bully, never cave, keep your cards close, target retaliation precisely, build alternatives with like-minded countries. Understand that the fever will eventually pass, but do not wait for it. Build Canada's strength in the meantime. Your generation has lived long enough to distinguish between leaders who say things for the cameras and leaders who say what they actually believe and then do it. This interview is the evidence that Carney is the second kind. The man who sat in that chair and told the BBC Canada would not be pushed around is the same man who has been standing at press conferences in Alberta and Charlottetown and Mexico City saying exactly the same thing with the full authority of Canada's highest office behind him. He saw this moment coming, he described it accurately, and he prepared Canada for it before most Canadians even knew his name. Subscribe to Canada Line for honest analysis of the leaders and decisions shaping Canada's future. Turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one.